Why this game of chicken is more like a game of ego, which is really like a game of Russian roulette and may end up being a game of Chinese takeover. We'll talk about that next on Get Right with Lenny McAllister, starting right
now. Get Right with Lenny McAllister.
Once again, it's so hit me.
The way we help bring back America and we build the bridges and bring people together is by making sure we hold everybody accountable in a 360 fashion.
So let me close with this. Yes, there is a change that we can believe in, but it will never come from a politician or a government program.
You cannot find physical sanity here in the land of Lincoln from Carbondale to Elgin that we collectively continue to tolerate the insanity found on the streets of South Chicago and these neighborhoods of the world.
We got to move away from the American Idol soundbite nature of politics and back to the American statesman of humble servant leadership that we used to see in politics.
It is time to roll out the era of the new, educated, engaged, and energized American citizen.
I go do the jail ministry. I speak to the kids in the streets. So I'm never going to lay down being conservative just as much as I'll never lay down being a proud African American.
I feel like a black republic. Money I got coming in. Can't turn my back on the hood. I got love for them. Can't clean my act good. Too much thugging.
Now, I would like to say that I simply cannot believe that we're at this point of time when it comes to the debt ceiling increase, when it comes to the negotiations that we need with this government shutdown, that we're at this point of time when it comes to government spending and all the other stuff that's going on Capitol Hill and out of Washington and with the federal government and President Obama and the Republicans and the Tea Party and the Democrats and the progressives and all that other stuff. I wish I could say that I'm surprised that we're at this point in time, but I'm not in some regards. I actually called that we would be done on Tuesday, possibly today on Monday. So here we sit on Columbus Day trying to discover ourselves, and it may end up being like how Christopher Columbus discovered America. By accident, by chance, the same accidental diplomacy that we saw with Syria, maybe the accidental negotiation between the Republicans and Democrats, the Tea Party and President Obama, and all the players involved in this. And we'll get to that as we go through this edition of Get Right with Lenny McAllister, the podcast, where I invite you to dialogue with me and to talk amongst yourselves, whether it's on Twitter, you know the handle, LENNYMCALLISTER. On Facebook, very simply, go to tinyurl.com/Lenny Page. That's LENNYPAGE. Love to get your feedback. Always enjoy your feedback and your commentary, whether it's on my articles for Global Grind or some of the other places that I write. This is going to be another American Urban Radio Network week for me, where I'll actually be going up against some folks that I know rather well, the folks over at Rainbow Push and the Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. And I don't want to stay on this very long, but what I've gone through with dealing with that organization is almost the epitome of what's going on in Washington. We continuously say that we need to bridge gaps and talk to people that we normally wouldn't talk to and come to solutions as Americans with folks that we generally don't agree with politically, but we share the American kindred with. We are part of the American fabric together. But then once you do that, everybody calls you a traitor, a sellout, you're a spy, you're not being true to the people that put you there, or your side of the aisle or your side of the equation, as if the other side automatically are not Americans because you disagree with them. And in my little small world, I mean, that's the epitome of that. I had an opportunity to work with some of the good people at Rainbow Push, had an opportunity to travel with Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr., who to me, listen, the guy desegregated towns in America. He marched in the 60s. He's one of the few people that actually marched in the 60s. You hear about all these civil rights folks. A lot of them are dead. He is not dead. So to be able to at least get that experience, it's invaluable. Now, does that mean that we sat there during this civil rights trip and talked about politics and I agreed with everything he said or every policy that would come from him? I mean, obviously not. I'm a Republican. He's a Democrat. But that's the whole point of having this American system of government. You have to be able to go to the table and talk to people and work through solutions so that the American Republic can continue on as the greatest nation in the world. So, outside of my own little world, let's go back to what's going on in Washington. I want your feedback, want your responses, Twitter, Facebook. You can talk about that if you really, really want to. Some have. But, you know, it's up to you. But back to Washington. I said that you're finding this game of chicken that's going on between the Republicans and the Democrats as we're approaching Thursday, October 17th, to be a little bit too much for taste for a lot of Americans. They are frustrated with everybody. In fact, there was a poll, everybody I'm sure has heard of this poll, where literally people were asked, would you want to throw every single member of Congress out of their seat, including your own congressperson? 60% of Americans polled in this one particular poll said absolutely, positively. That's not good. The approval rating of Congress, I think, is at 10% or 9%. I actually believe it's in the single digits now, which means that when it was at 14% and we said that was the floor, it can't get any lower, guess what? It got lower. It's now in, I believe, not 7, but I think it's like 8 or 9% approval rating. And those are just the hardcore people, and that's it. That's nobody else outside of hardcore people voting for folks. And that's a shame. But this game of chicken, and I listed it out, this game of chicken is now becoming a game of ego, which is more like a game of Russian roulette, which may lead to a Chinese takeover. Now, what do I mean by that? I know that might sound like hyperbole. You understand the game of chicken. We should have had an agreement by now. I really thought we'd have it over the weekend. We do not. So here we sit on Monday, hoping that we'll get there. Anytime a moderate Republican comes to the table, works with a moderate Democrat, and that deal is not accepted because it's not too much on one side or the other. The White House did not want this deal, and I would bet your bottom dollar that the House Republicans, there's a faction of those Republicans that did not like the Susan Collins deal either. Basically what they were saying was delaying the medical device tax. They were pushing the debt ceiling and raising it through, I believe, mid-November. They were doing a budget through first quarter 2014. They were doing some adjustments to Obamacare, and that was just enough for everybody to say, well, you know what, that makes a little bit too much sense. You're too moderate. So back to the game of ego within this game of chicken, where basically everybody's going to tug, and we're going to get up to this deadline. We're playing Russian roulette, not just with the debt ceiling, because I don't think we're going to hit the debt ceiling. But what's going to transpire, I believe, is this game of political Russian roulette that we had in 2011. And what did that lead to? First of all, that led to a credit down rating. And granted, the world continued on after they downgraded our credit as a nation for the first time in the history of this nation. But another one is not going to obviously be any better than the first time. The first time was a shock. I think the second time will have much more of an impact. Because the first time you can say that's an unfortunate oops, if you will, but the United States understands now. They'll get it together. They'll never risk this again, and they're going to get that AAA rating right back up before you know it. Here we sit 2 years later, over 2 years later, and that hasn't transpired, and we're about to risk it yet again. This is a game of Russian roulette to me that I think could lead to a Chinese takeover. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that the Red Army is about to paratroop into the West Coast and invade from California to Washington, D.C.? No, not in a military fashion. But if you recall, when we ended up with this crisis in 2011, the Chinese, who had already been manipulating the currency, who had already been in a position within our economy of power, because they're in a position of power because they end up holding a lot of the bonds in our market. So they're one of our debtors. We're obviously playing games with our debt ceiling. It's not so much that they're going to call the loans. that would lead to possibly this Russian roulette that goes to a Chinese takeover. It's the move they made in 2011, moving into 2012, where they basically said, listen, the United States has been irresponsible with the market. They caused this global meltdown in 2008. They have now caused another global situation with their downgrade of credit and playing this do-si-do with the debt ceiling. Their political environment is so turbulent right now that we cannot trust the American dollar to be the currency of the global economy. Therefore, we contend that it should be moved to the yen. Now, if you think we have problems now in the United States of America from a global standpoint, allow that transition to happen. Now, I'm not saying we're on the precipice and that's going to happen next week. That's not going to happen on the 18th of October if we go past this deadline. That's not going to happen if we have a downgrade. It's not going to happen immediately, if you will. But you cannot continue to have these type of scenarios politically in the United States of America and allow other nations, particularly a place like China, that can care less about the environment. They're going to be an industrial power, even if it looks like Pittsburgh from the earliest 20th century, the earliest parts of the 20th century, where it literally looked like 6 o'clock in the evening at high noon in the summertime, where literally they had so much pollution. It's a true story. Go look this up. So much pollution in one of the valleys here in western Pennsylvania that the smog contained a weather system and caused a catastrophe. They can care less because they're going to catch up, and they see themselves as being the, not a. They see themselves, the Chinese, as being the economic power of the 21st century. They feel like they have the population, they have the technology, they have the military might to make sure they enforce it, and they're going to dictate the terms moving forward. The last thing we want to do as Americans, and I want your feedback on Twitter, on Facebook, the last thing we want to do as Americans is give them more fodder for this argument. Bottom line is, 50, 60 years ago, the reason why the United States of America was the global superpower that the world, the free world, because I mean there were some within the Soviet bloc, but within the free world that people looked up to and that people gravitated to, and even within the Soviet bloc, they were pining to be Americans. The reason why was twofold. Number one, we had the military strength to, in essence, ensure that liberty and freedom had an opportunity, that democracy had an opportunity to spread and to ferment and to be this great personal individual harvest within the hearts and minds and souls of people around the world. But the other reason why we were able to do that, one, the military strength, but the other reason why is because we had the economic strength to do it. The Soviet Union was not necessarily the economic strength that we were. They were not impacting the global economy like we were. We were giving them wheat. We were giving them food. They couldn't even get their economic system in order because of the central planning system that they had ended up leading to chaos and waste. So even though you had all the military power that you had there in the USSR, you could not utilize the full strength of your people from an economic standpoint. So between the military strength and the economic strength, we could dictate the terms geopolitically around the world. The world is different now. And yes, we know that we have Red China that we're dealing with. And we still stand against any system of communism because we understand how it oppresses people. However, when our system of government, when our democracy gets so out of whack, where we act in an extreme fashion and we start impacting our economy to a point where it still hasn't grown the way it has needed to have grown since 2008. We're still talking about records amount of people dropping out of the workforce on a monthly basis. We think that 7.3% unemployment is a good thing, knowing that hundreds of thousands of Americans no longer are looking for jobs. And then, not just once, but twice, we are running up against this debt ceiling and playing this game of chicken out of egos, which is nothing more than Russian roulette, and is giving the Chinese more and more of an opening for a global takeover. Now, it doesn't mean, like I said, the Chinese are going to come over here and we're going to get rid of our system of government, but they will if this continues. And if they can have more control over the global economy, they will have more control geopolitically. For example, you may say, this is hogwash, Lenny. You're going overboard, and that doesn't make any sense. Really? Let's go to Syria. Let's go to 2011, Syria, Libya. I still tell you, the reason why we did not stop the Syrian massacre over 2 years ago, and we took our attention and put it towards Libya, is because who is going to stop us in Libya? We make an example out of Gaddafi, which, some could argue that maybe we didn't need to do that at that point in time, especially when there's a Syrian massacre going on also in the Middle East, in the way of the United States of America in Libya in 2011. Versus, and this is what happens when you have these type of economic scenarios. This is how it plays out in the geopolitical realm. Versus in Syria, where you have backing the Syrian government, you have the Iranians, who we're already at odds with, which of course can create this huge scenario where it could lead to World War III because of the Iranians and the Israelis. But more than that, the Russians, which are kind of sort of our allies now, but we have tense negotiations and conversations and interactions, etc. So that's bigger than the Iranians, because the Iranians kind of sort of, we think, are on the verge of a nuclear weapon. We know the Russians have it. We don't really trust Putin, but you know what? It's not as bad, obviously, as it was in the 60s and the 70s. No Cuban Missile Crisis. No false alarms like there was in 1983, where we almost had nuclear war. Go look it up. But bigger than that, and back to my point as far as the game of chicken, that's nothing more than a game of egos, which is running into being basically Russian roulette, that's leading to a possible Chinese takeover, aside from the Iranians and the Russians backing the Syrian government and backing al-Assad. You have the Chinese holding a lot of our bonds, having a huge investment in our economy, having about 1 billion people in their population, and having a pretty strong military of their own and nuclear weapons. So now you have this emerging economic power that is a global power from a military standpoint, that is backing the opposite side of where we are in a civil war that one could argue nobody should get involved in, and others could argue that everybody has a stake in. Right now, we're at a stalemate in some regards in Syria, where the Russians negotiated a deal where, Nobel Peace Prize winner President Putin. Oh, wait. President Obama was the Nobel Peace Prize winning president. My bad. But you get my point. We have a stalemate because people talked. Part of that is because America is still number one in the global economic realm, because that dollar is the root, is the foundation of the global economy. When you change that, and if you continue to have these political scenarios where you risk that, where every time we have this type of situation going on with Congress where we cannot get along, where we see each other as the absolute enemy, where people see Democrats as being just as socialist as the former USSR, as Red China. When people see, they see Republicans as being just as fascist as Mussolini and Hitler. When you start using those terms and genuinely start thinking of other Americans in that realm, and you risk all this, you risk hitting the debt ceiling. You shut down your federal government for 2 weeks now. 2 weeks. It's been shut down for 2 full weeks right now. People are going to work and not making any money. Or they're completely furloughed. When you have these type of scenarios going on, and this is literally the second major time in 2 years after an election where your president's been reelected, you run the risk of giving up global power. And I don't know, and I love your feedback on this on Twitter or on Facebook. I don't know if Congress is sitting there thinking about that in those terms. They're talking about reducing spending. I get that. I understand that. Down with that. They're talking about delaying Obamacare, keeping Obamacare in, the medical device tax, raising the debt ceiling, no one's even talking about getting people back to work. So even if you included that into the mix, that would be an improvement. They're talking about all the other political fighting. They're not necessarily even talking about getting people back to work. That was the whole impetus of opposing Obamacare in the first place. It was job-killing legislation. No one's even saying that as much as they used to. So even if you included that into the conversation, it still misses this point as I wrap up. You cannot continue to risk America's standing as the global leader economically. Because once you give that up, you run the risk of also giving up America's status as the geopolitical force throughout the world, the one that people listen to. And as you could see with the Syrian situation, that's creeping away. There's no way Putin should have been able to negotiate the terms of how that was going to go down. That was America's role. And it definitely was America's role 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It's not as much now. That's the danger when you continue to play these games politically and you can't find a way to get along before this point of time. Hopefully we get this done. Hopefully by the time I talk to you tomorrow, this discussion is over. What do you think? What are your thoughts? I'm looking forward to talking to you on Twitter, on Facebook. You know where to find me. Again, Twitter, LennyMcAllister. Looking forward to hearing and talking to you on the American Urban Radio Network, where we have some new and wonderful things for you coming up this week. In the meanwhile, you know I love you. Want to talk to you soon. Let's vibe back and forth, and let's have a wonderful, wonderful Monday. TCNGB, you know I love you. Take care, and God bless.